3. True Terrifying Horror Street Stories. The road leading into Black Hollow, Montana, stretched endlessly under the dim glow of the full moon. Thick pine trees loomed on both sides, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Inside a rusted old pickup truck, Claire adjusted her hoodie, pulling the sleeves over her hands as she stared out the window. Beside her, Mark gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Behind them, Lucas and Emily whispered nervously. They were heading to the abandoned Winchester Asylum, closed down decades ago, after a fire killed dozens of patients. A dare, a stupid college tradition, had dragged them here. Mark smirked. Just 15 minutes inside, take a few pictures, and they'd be legends back at campus. Easy. But as the asylum came into view, something felt wrong. The windows, shattered and dark, seemed to watch them. The air turned heavy. Lucas shivered. Maybe we should. The truck's headlights flickered. The engine sputtered and died. Silence swallowed them whole. Then, a shadow moved across the asylum's entrance. Not fast. Not slow. Just wrong. Mark exhaled sharply, trying to laugh, but it came out forced. All right, let's get this over with. As they stepped out, the night swallowed their voices. The asylum doors, slightly ajar, groaned as if exhaling after decades of silence. Claire's breath hitched. The air smelled of something rotten, something old. They stepped inside. The temperature dropped. Emily clutched Claire's arm. Their footsteps echoed down the ruined hallway, past rusted wheelchairs and peeling wallpaper. Then, a sound. A dragging noise. From the darkness ahead, something moved. Something that shouldn't be there. Something waiting. And it whispered Claire's name. Claire's breath hitched. A whisper slithered into her ear, so close it sent a shiver down her spine. She spun around, but the others stood motionless, their faces barely visible in the dim light. They hadn't heard it. The asylum pressed in around them, the air thick with decay, dust, and something else, something unseen but very much present. The flashlight in Mark's trembling hand flickered, its beam struggling against the suffocating darkness. Then, a sound. Slow, deliberate footsteps from deep within the corridor. Lucas tensed, jaw tight. Emily's grip on Claire's arm tightened. Mark muttered, "Let's just take the damn pictures and leave," lifting his phone. The camera flashed. And, for a split second, at the far end of the hall, something stood there. Tall, unmoving, a silhouette where no one should be. Claire's stomach twisted. She blinked. It was gone. But the feeling of being watched of something waiting clawed deeper into her skin. A door creaked somewhere ahead. No one had touched it. The air turned colder, sharp like winter breath. The whisper came again, stretched and distorted. It spoke her name. The sound of it wet, crawling, wrong made her head spin. Then came the footsteps. Faster this time, but uneven, dragging. The shadows along the walls shifted unnaturally, reaching. The lights from their phones flickered and died, plunging them into blackness. The air thickened, pressing down on them, suffocating. Then slam. A door to their right slammed shut. Another followed. Then another. The sound echoed, a rapid heartbeat of closing doors. Claire felt it before she saw it. A breath against her neck, damp and hot. A shape moved in the darkness, closer, impossibly close. She wanted to scream, but the air in her lungs had turned solid. Then, from the black, a voice. Not whispered this time, but guttural, rasping. "Don't run." The darkness felt alive. It wrapped itself around them, thick and suffocating. Claire's heart thudded in her chest, loud enough for the others to hear. The air tasted of rust and decay, and every inch of the crumbling asylum seemed to press in on them. Mark's voice was a desperate whisper. "We need to get out. Now." His hand fumbled for his phone, but it had stopped working. Nothing but a black screen staring back at him. Emily's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, her breathing shallow and quick. Lucas was still, unnervingly so. The darkness seemed to swallow his form as he stared into the hallway ahead, his eyes unfocused, like he could see something they couldn't. Claire reached for his arm, her fingers brushing against his cold skin. "Lucas?" she whispered, but he didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the hallway, unmoving. She felt a coldness creep up her spine, a creeping sensation like something was crawling just beyond her vision. The sound of dragging footsteps broke the silence, slow and deliberate, but there was no one in sight. The others heard it too, their bodies stiffening in unison. Every instinct told them to run, but no one moved. The footsteps came closer, closer still, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, waiting, watching, and it hungered. Emily clutched Claire's arm tighter, her nails digging into her skin. Claire winced, but her attention was fixed on the shadows ahead. The footsteps stopped. The stillness that followed was unbearable. The shadows in the hallway shifted unnaturally, twisting and stretching, as though the walls themselves were alive, pulsing with something dark and ancient. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Claire saw it. A figure, barely discernible in the gloom, just at the edge of the light. It moved, too quickly, darting between the walls, slipping in and out of view. It was talon-naturally tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in impossible ways. Claire's breath caught in her throat. "Did you see that?" she whispered to Emily, but Emily was too terrified to speak, her eyes fixed on the same place Claire's were. The figure moved again, closer this time, and then, in the blink of an eye, it was right there in front of them. Claire could barely make out the outline of its face, but she saw its eyes shallow, black pits that seemed to pull in all light around them. They stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, the weight of its gaze pressing down on her like a physical force. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't respond. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity. The figure's mouth opened, impossibly wide, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. The stench of death filled the air, a rancid odor that made Claire gag. And then it spoke. The voice was low and guttural, like it was coming from deep within the earth. "You shouldn't have come here." It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a voice at all. It was a presence, a sound that resonated within her very bones. The air around them thickened, growing heavier by the second, suffocating them, pressing down on their lungs. The shadows shifted again, closing in on them like a living thing. The walls groaned, the old building itself protesting against the malevolent force that had been awakened. Mark finally found his voice, his words strangled with fear. "We need to leave. Now." He stumbled backward, pulling Emily with him, but Claire couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the figure that stood before them. Lucas, however, did not seem afraid. His eyes were wide, yes, but there was something else there, something dark and knowing. He stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "It's too late," he muttered, his voice almost detached. Claire turned to him, her pulse pounding in her ears. "What do you mean it's too late?" she demanded, but Lucas didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the figure, and then, as if in a trance, he reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the air. The figure's eyes flicked to Lucas, its mouth stretching into a grotesque smile. "You're already a part of it," it hissed. Claire's blood ran cold. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows were closing in faster now, suffocating the room, warping reality itself. She reached out to grab Lucas, to pull him back, but her hand passed through him as if he were made of smoke, and then he was gone and vanished into the dark. Mark and Emily screamed, stumbling backward into the wall, their voices echoing off the old brick as the lights flickered and died, leaving them in absolute darkness. The sound of footsteps resumed, but this time they weren't the slow, deliberate steps of the figure. These were fast, frantic, like something was chasing them. And then it was gone. For a moment, there was only silence, thick and oppressive. But Claire could still feel it something, watching them from the shadows. waiting. The darkness had shifted. It was no longer just a backdrop to their fear. It had become something much worse, something alive, and they were trapped in it. The silence that followed was suffocating, a heavy weight pressing down on their chests. Claire couldn't move, couldn't think. The air around her felt thick, like it was solidifying into something tangible, something unnatural. She blinked, trying to adjust her eyes to the darkness, but it was like the shadows themselves were alive, shifting and warping. The hallway had seemed endless when they first entered, but now, in the oppressive gloom, it felt like it was closing in on them, shrinking with every breath. Mark's voice cut through the air, trembling with fear. We have to get out. There's no time. His words were shaky, but they were the first sign of life Claire had heard from him in what felt like an eternity. He pulled Emily to her feet, but Emily seemed paralyzed, staring blankly at the walls, her face ashen and pale. The sound of something dragging across the floor echoed from the dark corridor ahead, a slow, scraping noise that seemed to come from every direction at once. Claire turned to look at Lucas, but he was no longer where he had been standing. Panic surged through her chest. "Lucas!" she cried, her voice breaking. No answer. She took a hesitant step forward, but her legs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. She could feel her heartbeat thundering in her ears, each pulse louder than the last, and yet everything else was unnervingly silent. The shadows around her seemed to close in tighter, and she felt something move just out of the corner of her eye. It was a flicker, just a shadow, but it was enough to send her pulse racing. Mark's grip on Emily tightened, but they didn't move. "What's happening? Where is Lucas?" His eyes darted around wildly, but there was nothing, only darkness, that suffocating, living blackness that seemed to pull everything into itself. And then the sound came again, dragging, slow, and deliberate, like the sound of nails scraping against wood, but much louder now, much closer. It came from behind them, but when they turned to look, there was nothing there, only the endless stretch of the hallway, its walls twisted and warped in the dim light of their flashlights. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within the shadows, sending a wave of cold terror through Claire's veins. It was the same noise they had heard earlier, but this time, it was unmistakable, like something was breathing just beyond the edge of reality, something ancient, something wrong. The air seemed to crackle with energy, as though the building itself was alive, vibrating with a force beyond comprehension. Claire's mind raced. They had to leave, had to get out of this place before it consumed them. But how? The walls weren't just closing in, they were shifting, folding in on themselves, bending the reality around them until nothing made sense. The hallway they had walked down moments ago was now impossibly long, a dark tunnel stretching endlessly ahead. And then she saw it. A figure, standing just at the far end of the hall. It was tall, unnaturally so, with arms that stretched too long, limbs bending in ways that no human body should be able to. Its face was a blur of shadows, but Claire could feel its eyes on her cold, empty, hollow eyes that stared through her, stripping away every last ounce of her sanity. Emily gasped beside her, and Claire spun around, but Emily wasn't there. She was gone, vanished without a trace, as though she had never been there at all. Mark was screaming her name, but his voice was distant, fading into the overwhelming silence. Claire reached out for him, but when her hand touched his shoulder, it was cold, like ice. She turned to face him, but his eyes were empty, lifeless, staring blankly ahead. "Mark?" she whispered, but his lips didn't move. The shadow at the end of the hallway twitched, its limbs stretching further, impossibly long. Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't respond. She was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sight before her. The figure's mouth opened wide, too wide, a grotesque gaping hole of blackness that seemed to stretch forever. From within the darkness came a voice deep, echoing, like the growl of something ancient and hungry. "You are mine," it hissed, its words sending a ripple of terror through Claire's entire being. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and the walls around her began to crack and splinter. as if the building itself were coming apart. Mark was gone. Emily was gone. They had disappeared into the blackness, and Claire was alone, standing in the heart of the darkness that now seemed to have consumed everything. Her pulse raced, and her chest tightened. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were alive, moving, reaching toward her, pulling her into the depths of their cold, suffocating grasp. Claire backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure was no longer just standing, it was moving toward her, its long, twisted limbs dragging across the floor in a slow, deliberate crawl. With a scream, Claire turned and ran, but the darkness was everywhere, closing in on her, wrapping around her like a suffocating cloak. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. The walls, pressing in from all sides. Every step she took only seemed to lead her deeper into the void. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and she could hear the sound of something moving just behind her, following her, drawing closer. And then, in an instant, everything stopped. The darkness swallowed her whole, and the world around her collapsed into nothing. Claire was gone. Claire's mind raced in a blur, but everything was so strange, so warped. She couldn't breathe. The suffocating air was thick with a sense of impending doom. Every time she tried to move, the shadows seemed to grow longer, deeper, more oppressive. The hallway, if it could even be called that anymore, had become an endless stretch of darkness, shifting and folding as though it had a mind of its own. Her footsteps echoed like a countdown, each one more final than the last, and the walls around her seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, reacting to her presence. She could still hear Mark's voice, faint and broken, calling her name from somewhere far behind her. But it sounded wrong. It wasn't him anymore. It was a distorted imitation, a cruel mockery that made her insides churn. His voice sounded hollow, as though it had been twisted by something dark and sinister, something not quite human. "Claire," the voice whispered again. But this time, it wasn't just his voice. It was joined by others, whispering, murmuring, a chorus of anguished cries, filling the space around her like a suffocating cloud. The darkness seemed to ripple, shifting like liquid shadows. It moved in unnatural patterns, forming grotesque shapes in the corners of her vision. Something was in the walls, something alive, something waiting. The temperature plummeted, and Claire's breath came out in shallow, quick bursts, visible in the cold, damp air. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon her, a presence in the dark, watching her every move. Her fingers trembled, clutching onto the walls, as if they might give her some form of support, but they felt like ice, like they were pulsing with something that was not right. Then, she saw it. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, something long and sinewy, something that didn't belong. She turned quickly, but the moment her eyes focused, it vanished. And yet, the feeling didn't. It lingered, an unsettling presence that seemed to inch closer with every passing second. The shadows were moving faster now, slithering across the walls, pooling in the corners, reaching out to her like a living, breathing thing. Claire's pulse quickened. She didn't know what she was running from anymore, but her instincts screamed at her to keep moving, to keep running, to escape whatever horror had found her. Her legs felt like lead, heavy and uncooperative, and the darkness seemed to pull at her, dragging her toward it, towards something worse, something that was waiting in the depths of the unknown. The longer she stayed, the more she could feel it closing in on her, tightening its grip. Suddenly, the wall to her left gave a soft groan, as though something was pushing against it from the other side. Claire froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, and her ears rang with a low, guttural growl, something that resonated deep within the very walls. She could hear it, feel it vibrating in her bones. It wasn't an animal, not a creature she could name. It was something older, something predatory. And then, the lights flickered. A harsh, unnatural hum filled the space, and for a moment, the world around her became a blurry mess of shapes and shadows. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to stay calm. When the light stabilized again, the hallway had changed. The walls were cracked now, jagged and uneven, like the building itself was coming apart. The air had thickened, and now it tasted bitter, like metal or rust. Her gaze darted around, desperate for an escape, but the shadows had grown bolder. They stretched across the floor, creeping up the walls, and in the dim light, she could see figures distorted shapes slithering along the ground, too fast to fully comprehend. They were everywhere. Something was coming for her. She could feel it, could sense the malicious presence closing in from all sides, like the walls were shrinking, pushing her into a corner. She turned to run, but the hallway no longer seemed to stretch forward. It bent back on itself, looping at impossible angles. She couldn't tell which direction was which anymore. The corridor twisted and warped, folding like a piece of paper. Her chest tightened, and the claustrophobia of it all nearly crushed her. Each step she took only seemed to make the darkness grow thicker, more suffocating, and the shadows seemed to grow larger, pulling at the edges of her vision. Then she heard it again, another whisper, this one much closer. We're here. The words dripped with malice, a voice that was no longer human, that seemed to come from every direction at once. Claire whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. Her flashlight flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced along the walls. Something was in the darkness, watching her, waiting. And then, in the corner of her vision, she saw him. Lucas. But it wasn't him, not the Lucas she had known. His eyes were wide, unblinking, vacant. His body was contorted, twisted in unnatural angles, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that shouldn't have been possible. He was standing still, unmoving, but his eyes, those hollow eyes, followed her every movement. The smile on his face grew wider, inhuman, stretching too far. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't move. Her body refused to respond, as if frozen by the terror that had gripped her. The shadows shifted again, closing in, and the coldness in the air intensified. It was like the entire world was being suffocated by something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching, hidden in the depths of this forsaken place. Then, the ground beneath her feet trembled once more. It was a slow rumble at first, but it quickly grew louder, more violent, until the floor cracked open, jagged lines splitting the stone beneath her. From the depths of the crack, something crawled out, a figure, tall and monstrous, its body made of twisted shadows, its face a nightmare of distorted features. The creature let out a shriek, a sound so agonizing that it felt like it was tearing through Claire's very soul. She screamed, but no sound came out. The darkness swallowed her whole. Claire's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror. She couldn't move. Every part of her body screamed to flee, but her feet remained frozen to the ground. The creature before her was a blur of shadows and grotesque forms, its body contorting in unnatural ways, stretching and folding with an almost liquid-like fluidity. Its eyes were hollow, two black pits that seemed to pull her in, sucking her very soul into their depths. The air grew colder, and Claire felt as if the very temperature was dropping into a frozen abyss. Her breath came out in shallow gasps, visible in the cold air, but the chill didn't comfort her. Instead, it made the sensation of being trapped even more suffocating. The floor beneath her feet groaned and cracked, shifting in response to the creature's movements. It was as though the entire building had come alive, reacting to the presence of whatever nightmare had emerged from the darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest, a dull thud in her ears as she slowly backed away, unable to tear her gaze from the creature. It stood unnaturally still, but Claire could feel the pressure building, a tension that seemed to stretch out every second into an eternity. She could almost hear the echoes of her heartbeat, louder than the creature's rasping breath. The shadows around her seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, as if they were alive, drawing in toward her, feeding off her fear. She could see the walls, twisting in on themselves, bending into impossible angles, closing her in from all sides. The once familiar hallway had morphed into something otherworldly, alien. The air seemed to shimmer with an unspoken threat, vibrating with a low hum that resonated deep in her bones. It wasn't just the creature she had to fear, no, it was the very fabric of reality itself, warping and distorting as if some ancient force had laid claim to this place. The building was no longer a structure, it was a living, breathing entity, and it was watching her, waiting. Claire's eyes darted around, searching for some escape, but there was nowhere to run. The windows were gone, the doors locked, and the walls pressed in closer with every passing second. Panic began to rise in her chest, clawing at her throat, but she fought it down. She couldn't afford to lose control now. She had to think, had to find a way out. The creature made a soft, rasping sound, a hiss that seemed to reverberate through her very soul. It was watching her with a knowing look, as though it was aware of every thought, every fear in her mind. Then it moved. The creature's body twisted and stretched, a fluid, serpentine motion that defied logic. It was impossibly fast, darting toward her with a speed that left Claire no time to react. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stumbled backward, but the walls seemed to close in on her, trapping her in a corner. Her hands shot out, desperately searching for something to hold on to, but the darkness had already overtaken everything. The coldness, the overwhelming sense of doom it was all-consuming. She could feel the creature's presence drawing closer, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end as a low growl echoed through the air. Claire's vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she saw Mark standing there, his face pale and twisted, his eyes empty. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. It was as though he were trying to scream, to warn her, but he was caught in some kind of limbo, trapped between the world of the living and something darker, something beyond comprehension. The sight of him made Claire's stomach turn, and she knew, deep down, that he wasn't really there. He couldn't be. This wasn't real. It was all a nightmare, a cruel, twisted game, played by whatever force had claimed this place. A sharp, piercing scream ripped through the air, and Claire's eyes shot to the source of the sound. It was coming from behind her Mark's voice, but distorted, changed, like it was being twisted by something otherworldly. She turned, just in time to see him, or what was left of him. His body was contorted, his limbs twisted at impossible angles, and his face was frozen in a grotesque grin, his eyes black, lifeless. He reached out toward her, his fingers elongated, and the smell of decay and rot filled the air. It was the same stench that had followed her ever since they entered this place. Only now it was unbearable, choking her as it seeped into her lungs. Help me, Mark's voice echoed, but it wasn't him. It couldn't be. The creature had taken him, twisted him into something else. Claire stumbled back, her chest tightening as she looked for an escape, but there was none. The walls had closed in completely, and the shadow stretched out to claim her. The ground beneath her feet gave way, and she fell to her knees, the world around her spinning. The shadows engulfed her, their cold tendrils wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into the dark abyss. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the darkness receded. The walls seemed to pull away, the coldness lifting, and for a brief moment, Claire thought she was free, but that hope was fleeting. The creature was still there, watching her, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It wasn't done yet. It was just waiting for the right moment. And Claire knew, with a terrifying certainty, that whatever happened next would be far worse than anything she could have imagined. The nightmare had only just begun. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the corridor, the walls around her pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if it was alive, pressing in on her from all sides. She could still hear the echoes of Mark's distorted scream ringing in her ears, that horrible sound now seared into her mind. She tried to shake it off, tried to focus, but the terror that gripped her heart made it impossible to think clearly. The building, though, whatever this place had become, seemed to be alive, shifting, and changing, its very structure bending and warping with every step she took. Her feet scraped against the cold, cracked floor, the sound so loud in the oppressive silence that it felt like the building itself was listening. It was as though the walls were closing in around her, trying to trap her within their suffocating embrace. Claire's eyes darted nervously around, but all she could see were shadows long, stretching shadows that moved when she wasn't looking directly at them. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and the chill crept into her bones, gnawing at her very soul. Every breath she took felt like it was pulling her deeper into the darkness, into something she couldn't escape. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. A faint rustling sound coming from the end of the hallway. Claire's heart skipped a beat, her body tensing as she instinctively backed away. She wasn't alone. The realization sent a surge of panic through her chest. She had thought maybe it was just the wind or the house settling, but now she knew the truth. The creature, or whatever it was that had stalked her every step, was close, far too close. Her pulse raced as the sound grew louder, closer. The rustling morphed into a soft scraping noise, like something dragging itself along the floor. Claire's throat tightened, and her mind raced for an escape. There was no way out, no doors, no windows, just this endless, suffocating hallway. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to flee, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. It was as if the very air itself was holding her in place, forcing her to stay, to face whatever was coming. Then she saw it. A shadow at the far end of the hallway, moving toward her with unnatural speed. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and it glided with an eerie smoothness, its movements so fluid that they defied all logic. It wasn't human. No human being could move like that. Its body was a dark mass of shifting shapes, its limbs long and thin, twisted at odd angles. The air seemed to hum with an electric charge, the hairs on Claire's neck standing on end as the creature drew closer. Her breath caught in her throat as it came into full view. Its face was a void, an empty, formless mask that seemed to stretch and pull with every movement. The thing had no eyes, just black pits where they should have been, and yet Claire could feel its gaze, cold and penetrating, boring into her very soul. It wasn't just watching her. It was feeding off her fear, savoring the terror that flooded her senses. A sickeningly familiar sound echoed in the hallway. Mark's voice again, distorted and distant. "Help me, please. I can't breathe." His voice was ragged, broken, as if he were drowning in the darkness. Claire's heart wrenched in agony, but she couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the creature that was now mere feet from her, its black, gaping maw opening wide. She could hear the sound of something wet and slick, like the slithering of a serpent, as it slowly closed the distance between them. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging on for what felt like an eternity. Claire's mind screamed at her to move, to do something, but her body refused to obey. It was as if the creature's very presence was paralyzing her, filling her with a sense of doom that she couldn't escape. It was coming for her, and she knew, deep down, that there was nowhere to run. The creature's mouth opened wider, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth that gleamed in the dim light. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within its throat, vibrating the air around them. The sound was like a warning, a promise of something far worse to come. Claire's stomach churned, and the taste of bile rose in her throat. She couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, like it was choking her, suffocating her. It was all too much the darkness, the shadows, the creature, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness that gripped her chest. Then, without warning, the creature lunged. The world spun in a blur of movement as Claire's body snapped into action. She wasn't sure how, but she found herself running, her feet pounding against the cold floor, her heart hammering in her chest. The shadows seemed to reach out, grasping at her, but she forced herself to ignore the fear, to focus on nothing but escaping. She could hear the creature behind her, its breathing ragged. its footsteps echoing in time with her own. Every step she took felt like an eternity, each one leading her deeper into the labyrinth of terror that had become her prison. The hallway stretched on endlessly, its walls twisting and warping as if the building itself were alive, pushing her further into the nightmare. Claire's mind raced, her thoughts scattered, as she searched for anything, any way out. But there was nothing. No door, no window, no escape. And then, in the distance, she saw It-a-light. Faint, dim, but there. Her heart leapt with hope, and she pushed herself harder, her legs screaming in protest. But she couldn't stop now. Not when she was so close. The light grew brighter with each step, and she dared to believe for a moment that she might make it out of this hellish place alive. But as she neared the light, the creature's growl grew louder, closer. It wasn't far behind. The shadows seemed to thicken around her, reaching out with cold, insidious fingers, pulling her back into the dark. And just as she was about to reach the light, the world around her went black. Claire's eyes shot open, her body jerking upright in a panic. She was no longer running. She was lying on cold concrete, her arms and legs bound with thick, rough rope. The light she had seen was gone, replaced by a suffocating darkness that seemed to have no end. Her heart raced as she struggled against the binds, her breath shallow, ragged. She couldn't remember how she had gotten here, but the weight of the silence pressed in on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her surroundings were unfamiliar, the air thick with the musty scent of old decay, and the floor beneath her felt damp, almost alive, with moisture. The darkness around her was not absolute, it shifted, swirled, like it was alive, with faint shapes moving in the corners of her vision. She tried to sit up, but her head swam, and a sharp pain shot through her temples. The memories of what had happened flooded back the creature, Mark's voice, the sounds of terror as it came for them, the dark hallways, and then the blackness. Where was she? What had happened? Was she even still in the same building? A low hum filled the air, a strange vibrating sound that seemed to come from the very walls. The ground trembled beneath her, and a sharp pain shot through her hands where the ropes dug into her skin. Claire's body went rigid, as a cold whisper crawled through the darkness. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't her imagination. Something was here with her. She wasn't alone. The temperature in the room plummeted further, and she could feel the moisture in the air become thick, oppressive. Her breath came in visible puffs, but even in the cold, a trickle of sweat ran down her forehead. A shadow shifted at the far end of the room, slow, deliberate, like something was taking its time, savoring the moment. Her pulse quickened, her body tensing in fear, but she couldn't make a sound. The creature. Was it here? Was it watching her again? She couldn't tell. Her eyes scanned the room frantically, but there was no visible sign of it. Still, the oppressive presence grew heavier with each passing second, as though the very air was thickening with dread. Then, a sound. A soft scrape, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. The noise sent a chill down her. Claire's heart hammered in her chest as she struggled against her restraints, panic flooding her senses. She was powerless, and that feeling being utterly helpless, trapped in a nightmare that was so real, it felt like it was eating away at her, was the worst of all. The scrape grew louder, closer, and Claire could feel the air around her shift. Her eyes flicked to the source of the noise, her breath catching in her throat when she saw the figure that emerged from the shadows. It was humanoid, but wrong distorted, like a shadowy reflection of a person, its outline flickering and shifting as if it were struggling to maintain its form. The creature's face was a twisted mask, no eyes, just darkness where they should have been, and its mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin, jagged and horrifying. Claire tried to scream, but no sound came. She could only watch as the creature slowly approached, its movements jerky, unnatural, as though its limbs were not meant to bend that way. Every step it took sent a ripple through the air, like the very space around it was warping. The creature paused in front of her, tilting its head as though studying her, its grin widening, if that was even possible. Then, it spoke. The voice that came from its mouth was not human, not even close. It was a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the air, sending waves of nausea crashing through Claire's body. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing in her skull, reverberating through her very bones. "You should not have come here," it hissed. The words slithered around her, twisting in the air like a serpent wrapping around its prey. Claire's mind screamed, but her body was frozen. The ropes around her wrists felt tighter now, as though the creature's presence alone was enough to make them constrict. The room felt smaller, as though the walls were closing in on her, and the creature's presence filled every inch of the space, suffocating her. "You wanted to escape," it continued, its voice smooth and mocking. "But there is no escape. Not for you. Not for anyone." A cold, cruel laugh echoed in the room, and Claire's stomach lurched as the creature leaned closer, its face inches from hers. Its breath was foul, rancid, like the decay of something long dead. "You'll never leave," it whispered. "None of you ever do. You're already part of this place now, just like he is." Claire's heart froze. He? Who was it talking about? Mark? But had Mark been taken? Had it already gotten to him? Was it still alive? The creature didn't wait for her to answer. It leaned in closer still, its long, bony fingers twitching at her skin. Claire's body was trembling uncontrollably, her mind fighting against the paralyzing fear, trying to make sense of everything, but it was all a blur. A nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. And then, the figure straightened, its grin spreading wider still. "It's just beginning," it said, before the shadows around it deepened, swallowing it whole. The air felt colder, heavier, and Claire's eyes fluttered, dizziness overwhelming her, as the world around her seemed to close in even more. Her mind screamed for her to wake up, to escape, but deep down, she knew there was no escape. Not from the creature, from the nightmare that had become her reality. She was trapped. And whatever had happened to Mark, whatever was happening to her, was far from over. The walls creaked, the shadows flickered, and Claire realized with chilling certainty that she was not going to leave this place. Not alive. Claire's mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion as she lay motionless on the cold, wet floor. Her hands were still bound tightly, the ropes biting into her skin, but the pain felt distant, muted by the overwhelming terror that gripped her chest. Her thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around her, but nothing made sense. The creature had disappeared into the shadows, leaving her trembling in the suffocating dark, but its presence lingered. It was still there. She could feel it, crawling beneath the surface of her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a snake. The silence in the room was deafening, but it wasn't just the lack of sound. It was the oppressive weight of the unknown, the feeling that something was watching her, always watching, waiting for her to break. The hum, the low vibration that had filled the room before, was gone now. All that remained was the cold, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her breath came in shallow, quick gasps as she tried to gather the strength to move, to free herself, but her body felt heavy, as though gravity itself had increased its grip on her. The ropes around her wrists and ankles were still tight, unyielding. She couldn't escape. Not from the ropes, not from the dark, and not from the creature. And that thought, the realization that escape wasn't an option, that she was trapped in this nightmare, sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through her. She wasn't just afraid of the creature. She was terrified of what it had said, of the implications of its words. "You're part of this place now." What did that mean? What was it trying to tell her? Was it claiming her? She shook her head violently, as if trying to shake off the fear that clung to her like a second skin. But even as she fought against it, she could feel the pull, the gnawing sensation deep in her gut. A gnawing that wasn't just physical, but something darker, something more insidious. She had to get out. She had to find a way to break free, to escape, before whatever this place was consumed her completely. Claire's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that she wasn't alone. She had to be. She wasn't just hearing things. There was something in the room with her. But the darkness was thick, suffocating, and the shapes that flickered at the edge of her vision were nothing but shadows, fleeting and intangible. And then she saw it, a sliver of light. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, but it was there. Claire strained her eyes, focusing on the small crack in the wall where the light seemed to seep through. It was dim, it was real. It was a way out. Without thinking, her muscles screaming in protest, Claire twisted her body, forcing herself into a sitting position. The ropes cutting into her skin sent waves of pain through her, but she ignored them, the rush of adrenaline drowning out the pain. She had to reach that light. She had to get to it. But as she moved, the air seemed to thicken around her, the room growing even colder, even darker. Her breath came out in visible puffs, but it wasn't just cold air. It felt wrong, like the darkness itself was pushing against her, resisting her every movement. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crawled toward the light, each inch feeling like a battle. And then, just as she was almost within reach of the crack in the wall, the sound returned, a faint scraping, like nails on metal scraping against the floor, growing louder, closer. Claire's breath hitched as she froze, her body rigid with fear. She wasn't alone anymore. The creature was back. She could feel it, the air crackling with its presence. Her mind screamed at her to run, to move, but her body refused to obey. It was like the creature had locked her in place, its influence seeping into her very soul, paralyzing her with fear. The scraping grew louder, now followed by soft, slow footsteps. Claire could hear them now, the deliberate, almost mocking cadence of the creature's movements. It was toying with her. It knew she was trying to escape. It was enjoying her fear. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. The room fell silent again, except for the rapid pounding of Claire's heart. She held her breath, waiting for the next move, her eyes locked on the crack in the wall. It's not over, she thought. It's never over. Darkness pressed in around her again,